going to discuss the repercussions of when women speak up. And I think you'll find our conversation about voice and taking on the hard subjects of gender, race, and religion will be really fascinating and enlightening. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the panelists for this evening. In alphabetical order, first we have Dr. Beth Barr. Beth is Professor of History and Associate Dean of Graduate Studies at Baylor University. Her research focuses on women and gender identity in medieval and early modern English sermons, drawing evidence especially from comparative analyses of biblical women, narrative women, gendered language, and the gendered nature of biblical text. Her most recent book is The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. Our second panelist this evening is Dr. Anthea Butler. Anthea is Chair and Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. A historian of African American and American religion, her research and writing spans African American religion and history, race and politics, evangelicalism, gender and sexuality, media, and popular culture. Her recent book is White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America. And our third panelist this evening is Dr. Kristin Kobes Du Mez, who is Professor of History at Calvin College. Her research areas focus on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics in recent American history. She is the author of the New York Times bestselling Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. So we have a wonderful conversation ahead of us this evening. A few notes. I am going to refer to all of the panelists by first name to keep this conversational. This is not meant as a slight to the many accomplishments of our esteemed colleagues, but we do want to make this an opportunity for dialogue. We also want to make this an opportunity for all of you to listen, learn, and ask questions. So as you listen to the conversation tonight, and if you have questions, I encourage you to put them in the Q&A. There will be about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the panel discussion for questions from the audience. So please do participate in that way. We expect that this event will end around 8:15, 8:20. Right, so let's get started. First questions. Let's talk about your experiences writing your books. All three of you released really amazing books in the past year or so. So tell us about your experience writing those books. What were the choices that you made in writing them? Anthea, why don't you go first? Anthea, I think you are muted.
You know, it'd be really helpful if I would decide to unmute myself first so you could hear me. The decisions I made about writing this book, wow. I would have to say this has been a decision that came over 20 years. And that's a strange way to put this, because we think about books and kind of like you think about something, then you get a contract and you write them. But this has been over a big period of time. And part of it had to do with my experiences being first in an evangelical church and also in a seminary. And as a Black woman who was A, unmarried, B, sort of vilified because she wasn't married, and C, trying to figure out what was happening to me in terms of race in these churches. So as an aside story, I should probably say I'm Catholic. I now identify as Catholic. I was baptized and raised Catholic. I had my little time in evangelicalism. And so my decision to write this book was about part of what I saw happening in evangelicalism, which was a story that was being told about evangelicals, about themselves, that I didn't see happening to me. And that was this, that evangelicalism was great, that evangelicals had done lots of good things, but they weren't racist, and that everybody was just equal, men and women. And I knew that that was not the case. I also knew that that was not the case for evangelicals of color. So my experience about writing this book was one of loneliness. And I have to say that, frankly, because I wrote it during the pandemic. I had already started before the pandemic. And then when the pandemic happened, I had to write it in a vacuum. In other words, I didn't have the same kind of conversation partners I had. My editor, Elaine Maisner at UNC, was a fantastic conversation partner, but I didn't have the kind of normal conversations I would have had. So it was written basically in silence and a little bit of mourning. And the mourning was about how I had lost evangelical friends because of the changes politically and socially. And those people that I had left behind, I didn't know if they would ever read this book. And I sort of lamented what we lost because of that. And so I'd say it was a combination of resoluteness and sadness. Resoluteness because I knew it was something I had to do, but sadness because I also knew that I had already lost friends and might lose some because of writing the book.
Loneliness, lament, but also resoluteness. That's really powerful. What about you, Kristin?
Yeah, so I first started exploring the topic of evangelical masculinity and militarism more than 15 years ago. And so this too has been a project that's been brewing over time. And it was the fall of 2016, specifically the days after the release of the Access Hollywood tape, that I thought I probably need to do something with this. I need to dust off that old research. One of the reasons I hadn't pursued it earlier, first, there was life. I was writing my first book, a dissertation turned book, and I had a baby and then I had another baby. And so there were things happening. But I also, as I was digging into these questions around militant masculinity and evangelicalism in the early 2000s, I was struck by just how disturbing the evidence was that I was coming across. And I was having a hard time sifting, is this mainstream? Because it looks mainstream when I look at book sales, and yet it feels really extreme. And as a Christian scholar, Christian historian, I was kind of wondering, is this appropriate for me to be focusing in on this really disturbing aspect of American Christianity, of American evangelicalism? So it's kind of torn. When I decided that, yes, I'm going to write this book, it was intense because we knew very early on that there was a kind of deadline. It had to come out before the 2020 election. I made some choices. One of the choices that I made was very explicitly not to show deference to those in power. And this is like in contrast to, I had seen, I remembered back to, that early decision of like, do I really go here? Is this appropriate? It seemed like a kind of noble choice to be like, oh, maybe not, And then over the years, and then really when I dug into the research, I realized just how much historians of evangelicalism, many of whom were evangelicals themselves, had done the same kind of thing of, let's put the best face forward. Let's maybe not go there. Let's be a little gentle with this movement. And so it was a very intentional choice once I really started in to not show deference to those in power. I think another choice that I made up front was this book was not written for evangelicals as the primary audience. I'm really, really glad that many evangelicals are reading it. I wrote for an audience outside of evangelicalism. My editor was really great. He comes from definitely outside of evangelicalism. Many times, I get comments like, "I do not know what these words mean." It's like, oh, okay, let me translate this. So that was a really good practice, and I think that's I think those two things are evident in the book that kind of sets it apart from some other books that had been written on evangelicalism. But I will say, I didn't even feel like I was making a lot of choices. I was so driven, and I kind of knew exactly what I wanted to say. So it was just intense, but I never really didn't know what I wanted to write next.
That issue of not deferring to people in power seems significant to me, and I'm sure we're going to return to that theme later on when we talk about responses to all of your work. But before we go into that territory, Beth, I wonder if you have any thoughts about what the process was like for you as you wrote your book, and why you made the choices you made.
Yes, I'll do this briefly because I'm going to talk more in a moment. But my book was really an act of desperation. It really was. It was a last ditch that something has to be done. And I was speaking directly to evangelicals, which makes me a little different from what Kristin was doing. And in fact, I intentionally took on the tone of evangelicals because I wanted them to hear me. And I had reached a point where I suddenly realized, and part of this came from teaching women's history since 2008, where I taught the whole breadth from the ancient world up to the modern world. And I realized that what I was teaching my students was brand new to them, that they grew up in these evangelical worlds and they knew none of this. They knew nothing about how similar the Christian patriarchy that we use today looks just like the ancient world. They knew nothing about how patriarchy runs parallel with racism. And so I suddenly realized that I had a unique opportunity where I had the ability, I had the experience as a pastor's wife, somebody inside the evangelical world, and the opportunity to write this book. And so I wrote it in a last-ditch effort to help women.
So I'm hearing a lot of really deep moral commitments that are animating the choices you made. A desire to help women, lament and mourning, loneliness, a desire to speak truth to power. Now, let's address, I think, the big question that comes after that. You make these choices, you're clearly going to invite criticism. So how have critics responded, and what has that been like? And Beth, maybe because you were just talking about addressing the needs of your students, you could begin.
Yes. So the criticism has come from many different areas for the making of biblical womanhood, some of which I expected, some of which surprised me. So I think the areas that I expected it to come from, it did come. And that was, of course, the more conservative folk who really believe that biblical womanhood, the idea that women are under the authority of men, is part of the gospel. And that if you do not profess male headship, that you are diluting the gospel and that you are on the slippery slope away from Christianity. And so I think those folk have come after me with expected regularity, but also some unexpected ways. I didn't expect to have the personal attacks, which, I mean, I guess I did, but you're still not ready for it when they actually come. And so those were some of the things that surprised me a little bit with the vehemence of that, especially attacking my credibility as a scholar, as well as my personal story. I also did receive some criticism, and this too is sort of, I think all of my criticism has been widely seen outside, but I also have received criticism from a certain side of academics, people who are in my discipline, mostly in religious studies, who felt like I didn't go far enough, that by simply maintaining my belief in the Bible, that I was somehow, that essentially the thought is that Christianity is irredeemable, and that the Bible is so patriarchal that it's also irredeemable. And so that, it surprised me a little bit, but I also haven't worried too much about that because that wasn't my audience. And my evidence is, no one has attacked my evidence. It was mostly just how far I would push it. And then, of course, the final area that I've received some criticism it's probably the one that I'm most sympathetic to, and that is to the people of color, especially to Black women who feel like, we have not fully explored the implications that patriarchy, that this white evangelical patriarchy has done to Black women. And that is the one that I am most sympathetic to, and I'm totally in agreement that there is so much more work to be done on the implications of white patriarchy imposed upon women of color. So
I will say that I've heard a lot of conversation about your book in Asian American Christian circles as well, and the intersection of patriarchy, particular intersection of patriarchy in those spaces. It really has hit a nerve. So thank you.
Yeah.
Anthea or Kristin, what are your thoughts on what it's been like to receive criticism? What has it been
tell
like?
Kristin to go first because she probably you've been out longer than I have. You have things to say.
Okay. Well, so here's the thing. I mean, I expected this book would anger some people. And, when I wrote it, maybe I'm the only writer who has this, but you kind of imagine your critics all around you all the time. And so I expected a lot of pushback. The book itself is, I mean, one early reviewer called it urgent and sharp elbowed, and I absolutely love that characterization. Right? It is sharp elbowed, and if I'm throwing some elbows out here, I'm going to expect some pushback. And so all in all, it hasn't been nearly as bad as I thought. I mean, I had the entire manuscript vetted by my publisher's lawyer, which was a really good idea. And when we wrapped up that process, she told me, brace yourself, Kristin, brace yourself for vicious trolling. It's, you lock things down. And so I was like, okay, I don't know how to do that really, but it has not been that bad. When Ted Cruz retweets it, or when, Shapiro's Daily Wire picks it up, that's when I'll get some trolling. Actually, my university got the brunt of it, with a lot of people, writing to my president to try to get me fired. And that didn't work. So the pushback has not been nearly as bad as I anticipated. And what I did not anticipate at all was the incredibly enthusiastic response among evangelicals themselves. I mean, that has really blown me away. And it's not just kind of out there. It's not just in terms of book sales, but I get several letters in my inbox every single day from evangelical readers, from white evangelical readers, who say, thank you for this book. And so otherwise, let's see what kind of criticism. I think that I had anticipated more from the corners that Beth was talking about, kind of conservative evangelical, defenders of patriarchy. And they haven't really come out swinging much at all. And I don't want to tempt fate right now, but I've thought about that some. And I think maybe one of the reasons why is because I've moved the conversation off their turf. Their turf is theology. So they can argue this Bible verse or that interpretation or this, and they could do that in their sleep, right? They've done that for decades now. And this book moves the conversation to history. And we place their historical arguments in historical context and show how things have not always been this way. We show change over time. We show the construction of these ideals of masculinity, of femininity, of patriarchy, taking a particular shape and form in response to particular circumstances. And I think that that is unfamiliar turf for many of my critics.
Yeah. I was going to say, like Kristin, I thought I'd get a lot more too. Maybe it's coming, and I have gotten some, but I would say that as a veteran of Twitter, and having had so many things happen to me on Twitter that have been attacks, and you're racist because you talk about race, which is the classic one, right? So I'm definitely a racist. We all know this by now. It's one of those things where I think people don't know what to do because it's so much history. And I think that that's the thing that takes everybody aback about this book, because you think that this book is going to be an op-ed, but it's not an op-ed. And I really wanted people to sort of see that, oh, I got you for about 250 years here, and I'm proving my case and I'm prosecuting it. So the kinds of things that have happened where I'm going to call out this particular place thing in Current magazine, where that book got reviewed, which should have been another reviewer altogether, because this person did not read the book. And I know they didn't, because they didn't read the most important part where I talked about a personal thing that happened to me. And they just said, well, you're this thing. And I'm like, you read this wrong. And, that's when I get upset, when somebody doesn't actually deal with the comments of the book, first of all. And then they went to the angry Black woman trope, which really ticked me off, because I was like, if a man had written this book, you would not even have anything to say about the way in which I prosecuted this case, because I came about it as to prosecute a case about, here's what the story is about evangelicalism, just as much as that story is about abolitionism or temperance or missionary stuff and all the wonderful things that everybody talks about. There's another story to tell. And I wanted to tell that story. And so the kinds of letters that I get now are the people who are either ex-evangelicals who are like, sister, you finally told us the truth, or the people who say they're going to pray for me because clearly I'm reprobate. But I think the thing that kind of keeps it at bay somewhat is that I'm at Penn. And that is a whole different ball game. I'm not some, place where they can't, just say anything they want to say about me. They have to deal with who I am and where I am. And that is a different story. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't try to get me fired. I've had that happen before too, Kristin, so I understand it. But, I'm not going to get fired, not for the kind of things that they're trying to accuse me of, which aren't true in the first place.
So good. So good. I have to say, all three of you probably could offer a master class on how to deal with Twitter trolls. I must learn from all three of you. It's a lot. But also the personal attacks, the attacks coming in through your email inboxes, going to your university leadership. But I think it's important to sort of juxtapose it with, as Kristin pointed out, the acts of appreciation, expressions of gratitude. And also I'm dwelling on your last point, Anthea, which is you're in a position of prominence, and in a certain ways, it seems like there's a responsibility to use that position of prominence to, as you say, prosecute the case and make people understand this issue more deeply.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I just want to say one thing about that. I think that, one of the things that occurred to me when we talked about doing this was that evangelical men have been doing this for a long time. They get to have conferences and men get there and they make all this money and they do these books, and it's a handshake kind of thing where all the guys get together and they can talk about the quadrilateral, for those of you out there, that's Bebington, right? Chris and I just kind of threw that away and said that didn't matter anymore. And people are upset with us about that because, the question is always going to be theology. This is how they always want to critique women. You must not know theology, but the fact is all of us know this theology very well. What we're doing is saying, this is how you've left the theology and used this culturally to abuse and subjugate women. And I think that that is an important part of what this is. And so us getting together tonight is not just about, us talking about how to write these books and everything else, but we're stepping into the place that we should have been in from the very beginning to say, you need to listen to evangelical women too. And we have something to say about this history, about patriarchy, about how you treat women, about all of these things and how they affect people across continents, across cultural lines, across ethnic lines. And I think that's the important thing, that if anybody has to take away anything else, take that away as the reason why we're together tonight.
If I can add with that too, I think one of the things that I have found doing this is these networks of women, like the three of us, because I can tell you on some of the worst days, on my days, that I have gotten the background reinforcement from women reaching out and saying, hey, we're with you on this. And it has just been incredible. And it has shown me that if women actually stand together and do these things, we really can make a significant difference and help breaking down some of these barriers, which again is why we're here tonight.
Yeah, if I could add too, I mean, Anthea's exactly right that, I as I was researching Jesus and John Wayne, I was watching these guys operate, right? Within evangelicalism, the networks, the organizations, the platforming, the blurbing each other's books, the patting each other on the back, and this wasn't just about, influence. It was about money. It was so much money changing hands, and it is about power, and it is about defining orthodoxy and all of these things. And so I watched it happen as a scholar. And then now kind of being in this space, even in just a small part of this space, it's fascinating. And shout out to social media, right, to Twitter, for what it can do to destabilize these older power structures. Because, I joined Twitter, I don't know, 5 years ago, I think, maybe 6. And I, even when I published this book, I didn't have much of a following, but I actually went there first to listen in to conversations. And then when I saw what some of these conversations, what shape they were taking, and nobody was challenging some of these guys, that's not like, oh, okay, it's my job. I'm going to do this, right? Somebody has to jump in and just not every day, not all the time, but say, no, there's another narrative here. And so I started to do that more and discovered, first, I really like it. It's a ton of fun. And it is possible now, where I would never have been invited to these conferences. I would never have been invited into certain rooms or, platformed in certain ways. And I don't need to be anymore, because I can just send a tweet. And that's something that I'm participating in, but also really watching as a scholar in these spaces, that this is a disruptive moment and there is a democratizing effect that social media brings.
I love this. I love people using tools to advance their agenda, and people using networks and relationships to support each other in this really difficult work. I also have to say I've received a lot of pushback in the past year for my own work on anti-Asian racism, and it's Kristin who sent me chocolates in the mail that kept me up one night to finish one report. So thank you, Kristin, a little bit belated. At the beginning of this conversation, we talked about the choices you made in writing your books, and all of you had personal stories that rooted your decision to write the books and to make the choices you did. And my guess is that some of you might have included some personal narrative in the books you wrote. So let's talk a little bit about the complications, the opportunities involved with that, but also the perils, and maybe some of the costs. So who would like to go first?
I'll go first. Because it's a thing that everybody always asks me about. And I'm not quite sure how I want to talk about it, but I'll talk about it. There were moments that I pulled away from writing more personal stories in my book, in part because I wanted the book to be about this story about racism and not about me. But the one story that I do tell in the book about what happened to me right after the 1992 uprising or riots, depending on how you want to call it, in LA, in the church that I was at, was important to me because that was probably a big moment for me in terms of thinking about my place in a predominantly integrated evangelical, Pentecostal, charismatic Pentecostal church that didn't see me the way I thought they saw me, right? And then having gone on to an evangelical seminary and then to do my PhD, what I realized was that I was sort of this odd person out in a way. And the story that I really would have told in the book is about somebody who was a big person at the particular church that I went to, who was an African-American woman who had been in the denomination for a very long time and was on the pastoral board of the church. And I tell this story in her memory, in part because she didn't know what she was doing when she talked to me. So right before I went to seminary, I went to her office and her desk was piled up with books. She had, 20 of those pink messages. This was back in the 90s, where everybody wrote their messages on a little pad. And she was having her lunch out of a lunchbox. And she looked at me and said, "Don't go to Fuller and become a feminist." And that was her admonition to me. Meanwhile, there was another guy who had gotten my friend pregnant, who came to Fuller at the same time, that they gave $300 a month to. I got nothing. So I was told not to become a feminist. And the perp got $300 a month so that he could take care of my friend and the kid that he knocked her up with. And I just thought, what is going on here? And this was the kind of thing that I just thought, these things happen all the time. And so that was in the back of my mind when I was writing this, because it wasn't just about racism, the racism that had this woman at this church on the pastoral staff who didn't have staff support. And they said they loved her, but they kept treating her like she was basically like, mammy. And I'm going to say that because that's exactly how she was treated. And then to see the ways in which, I had to make my way. I didn't have a Black woman to help me during that time at Fuller. White men helped me. That's going to shock a lot of people, but that's who helped me. And the kinds of people who helped me were older white men who were like, "I see something. You need to go do this PhD. Let me help you do that." And so I had these kind of weird experiences where on the one hand, there was a lot of racism, but on the other hand, there was a lot of grace for people who saw me for what I could do in my intellect and actually helped me. And so I want to say to people, you read my book and you might think, "Oh, she's just mad at white people." That's not the case. The case is that this is a complicated story for everybody, but we have to deal with the foundational story of race and racism in this country and sexism and patriarchy that affect us.
I'll take this one next, because I made some intentional choices to not put much of my own narrative at all into my book. And that was for this book in particular. I'm actually changing that up a bit for my next book. So it was for this project in particular, for a couple of reasons. First of all, as a scholar who looks at evangelical popular culture, I know that there is a certain expectation for women writing in this subculture that personal narrative is kind of how you do it usually. And I knew that much of what is in Jesus and John Wayne is not my personal story to begin with. Right? I spent years researching. I've got thousands of pages of files. The research that went into this book. The original draft of the manuscript was 60,000 words longer than what this final draft is. So I just wanted to make abundantly clear that this was a work of rigorous scholarship. It was a work of history, and it is not my personal opinion. Now, I do appear in my book ever so briefly in the introduction, and that's because my editor kind of made me, to position myself as I do know a little something about this culture. So I give, and we kind of went back and forth on this. How do I do this? And I gave him, I think it's one paragraph. I don't remember how many sentences. When I sent it to him, I said, I feel like it's one sentence too many. And he's like, no, we'll take this. But what's really interesting is that, I saw somebody try to, detract from the authority of the book by saying it's all about her experience. Just that one paragraph was all it took to open that door. So for me, it was a very intentional choice not to go there. And the voice that I took, which is a kind of combative voice. There's humor in there. It's not a kind of kind and gentle book from subtitle on. I also did that very intentionally as a woman, right? It was intentional not to show deference. It was also very intentional to enter that fray and to do it as a woman. And I really liked that. I don't feel like the book would have worked as well if a man had written the exact same book in that tone. I think it would have given it a different kind of feel, but it felt really satisfying to say those words as a woman speaking about this culture and speaking into this culture.
Well, I'll jump in because I follow Kristin quite well because I did the opposite of what Kristin did. And I also was very intentional about that because I think, as what she said, this is how women do this. And I was speaking to a particular audience. I was speaking to evangelicals, and testimony is the language of evangelicals. We tell our testimony. And so I decided that if I was going to do this, and I have read all of the books that have all of the evidence that show that Christian patriarchy is not part of the gospel, that this is something external that we have added to it. But evangelicals aren't reading those books. They are not buying into those arguments. And so I decided if I was going to have any sort of impact at all, I had to use the evangelical voice to speak to evangelicals. So I told my testimony, and I had to, it was an intentional choice. In fact, I still remember when I told Kristin I was doing it, I said, I'm doing something different with this book, and I don't know how it's going to go. It opened me up to more criticism, I think, because of this. Experience is a double-edged sword for women. On the one hand, it is where we are often given credibility for. Women with platforms speak from experience. That's how you get credibility. Go read Kate Bowler. But at the same time, it is also what undercuts our authority. Because we're speaking from emotion, and we're speaking from, that it's just our feelings, and it's not based upon evidence. And so I knew that was happening, but at the same time, I also knew that this is how people would hear the evidence. That is, my argument is built on the evidence, but my testimony shows how it matters. And so it was intentional. It was hard. I'm actually a pretty private person. And so I remember it took me like 2 weeks when I decided to write that last chapter. took a lot for me to finally sit down and write it, because I was like, I don't know if I do this, I have done this and I can't go back. So it was hard, but it was worth it because women are hearing it. And like Kristin, I'm overflowing with messages from people. And even lately, I've started hearing from churches who are telling me that that they're moving on this position and starting to have elders and have women preach because of this. And so despite all the criticism, at the end of the day, it was worth it.
I'm glad you have found it's worth it. And it's interesting to hear about how many of you have described the experience of actually writing and not even getting to the point where people are responding to it, but the work of writing itself can be difficult and requires you to mine sort of spiritual and emotional resources, because that is hard. Thank you. We've touched on these issues a little bit obliquely already, but I'd like for us to think about this issue more directly. The importance of race and gender in shaping how people have responded to your books, engaged in it, either critically or positively. I'm curious to see if there have been any patterns, how whiteness has shaped the responses, non-whiteness. So yeah, I'm interested in hearing about that and how you think those identities have shaped what people have said. Anthea, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I was sitting here laughing, thinking, well, it's been interesting. I would say for the most part, almost everybody who's white who's talked to me about this book has either been somebody who left evangelicalism or somebody who's struggling with evangelicalism. And so for all of those people, they've been very apologetic, B, like, this is crushing because I knew it was bad, but I didn't know it was this bad, right? And a lot of people just didn't know the history. I mean, this was really very interesting to me about how they saw certain people like Billy Graham and others and what they thought that they were doing, right? So in one sense, it was an eye opener and also a cause for people to sort of say, I'm sorry, but they're also afraid to say, I'm sorry because I came down so hard on the racial reconciliation stuff. Because the racial reconciliation stuff for me is like, this is the dog and pony show. And we've had this dog and pony show so many times and it doesn't get us anywhere. So what does this mean, right? So that was one. I think for evangelicals of color, this has been a really interesting thing because what they have resonated to is like, I didn't have a word for what was happening to me. I didn't have the words for what was going on in my congregation, but I'm really upset about it, right? Or I just didn't know how to articulate all the things I experienced when I was there, and that's why I left, okay? And so that was also another thing that I think really sort of stood out. And to the point about women specifically, I think that was very true because there's all these kinds of stories, and I haven't gotten this very much, but I'd be really interested because it's a story I tell, a couple of stories about interracial stuff in the book. And so I'm thinking about the ways in which this might affect people who are in interracial relationships or marriages right now, who really haven't had that race talk, right? Or had this talk about, God brought us together and it's going to work out. But the same kinds of, things are happening, whether that's about patriarchy or evangelicalism and all of these kinds of things. And we can talk more about this later, but I'd be really curious, to start hearing from people like that, because I think that's where the big, problems might lie in terms of how people are trying to navigate this once they start to realize the kind of racist foundations of evangelicalism, first of all. And secondarily, that means that you have to sort of figure out, are you going to stay or are you going to go? Because it's not just about where you go to church, but it's actually about your identity. And that identity crosses over with your racial identity, your ethnic identity, all these different identities about yourself. You have to figure out what what is going to take precedence over the other thing when you've been told all the time that, being with Jesus Christ is the person that you are, and that everything else falls away after that?
Oh, I think that's great, Anthea. I had a really hard time figuring out what I was going to do with race and the making of biblical womanhood, because I wanted to do so much more, because I do think the stories of patriarchy and the story of racism are completely interconnected. I don't think we can get rid of patriarchy until we get rid of racism, and vice versa. I mean, I think the reason we have such a hard time uprooting racism is because we aren't uprooting patriarchy. I mean, I think these things are completely interconnected, which is why we need all of our books. We need all of the people working on different fronts on this. So there was so much more I wanted to do with that in my book, and that's the area I primarily cut, mostly because it was distracting the story. I only had 70,000 words, and I went 2,000 over. So what I tried to do instead was to include Black scholar voices. As much, especially in the area of theology, which I really tried, because that's the area that I think if white people listen to Black theologians and people of color, it would explode the foundations of biblical womanhood, just moving that out. And so that was an area that, I was like, what I can do in this story is I can pull in some voices that white people mostly don't read and that they don't learn in their seminaries. And so that was I was hoping to point towards the fact that we need to broaden the people that we listen to, and that biblical womanhood is something created by white people, and it is created in white evangelical racism. I mean, it was the white evangelical racist world that created this particular form of biblical womanhood. And so we need to come to grips with both of those things.
So I'll say in terms of gender, I think that the readership is rather equally split for Jesus and John Wayne between women and men, and women responding a little bit more in terms of processing the ways in which they've been subjected, the ways in which they've kind of suffered the brunt of some of this. For men, I actually get a lot of that of men who also felt deeply marginalized by these constructions of masculinity that they could never live into and up to. And so there's a lot of processing there. There's also a lot of acknowledgement of complicity among women and men, particularly among men. And so those are letters that give me a lot of encouragement. It's not just what was done to me, but what did I participate in, and why was I so comfortable in these spaces for so long? And why was I so oblivious to the harm that I was doing? In terms of race, I think interesting patterns among my white readers, particularly white evangelical readers or ex-evangelical readers, there is this sense of shock, right? Just this like, on the one hand, this is the story of my life. On the other hand, I had no idea. And now I see. Now I have eyes to see, and so that's something that I've had to process quite a bit. How could you not have a clue? And yet the level of shock is it is authentic, and that's something I've reflected on in a couple of essays. But among readers who are not white, so Black, quote unquote evangelicals, Black Christians, Asian Americans, and a fewer Hispanic readers, from what I can tell, are just, at least in terms of correspondence. But there, the response is different. There's no shock. It's just like, yeah, thanks for putting words to this. Thank you for, kind of wrapping it up in a neat bow. But yeah, there's nothing new here. We saw this all, and particularly from Black readers. So one of the things that I did try very hard to do in the book is to make whiteness visible. I started early on thinking I'm writing a book about gender, and very, very quickly I realized, oh, this is a book about race and about gender. It's not just evangelicalism, it's white evangelicalism. And I too have been accused of being a racist because I use the adjective white in the subtitle of the book. I mean, that just happens. and to make that whiteness visible, because within evangelicalism, race is rarely visible. So we could take something like Christian nationalism, take something like heroic masculinity, and just show how this is a white evangelical construct. And I can show you how it works. I can show you what it does. And then I think that's then actually really helpful to many white evangelicals to see what it is that they were actually participating in.
Can I say one thing here? Because I think this is the point where I alluded to something on Twitter today. So I said I was going to, shock Kristin because I was going to say something about R. Kelly and her book and how did this work out, right? But I think you already know what I'm going to say. And here's the other side of the Black evangelicals going, well, yeah, we knew that. But the other part of that is that the Black church members would say, well, that's white people, but they didn't recognize this same kind of thing in their own churches. They didn't recognize the same kind of patriarchal kind of structure, the same way that they talked about women, the same way that they vilified women that they thought were loose or Jezebels or anything else. And so when we get to R. Kelly getting convicted today, I just finished writing a piece about how all these Black churches really loved him. And like people saying, I believe I can fly. And all of these songs that they loved and danced to and made their choir sing, and all the events where you had that stupid song at, graduations and everything else, knowing this story since the 1990s. How is this allowed to continue in our community? The reason why is because of this kind of patriarchal structure that is based in whiteness. And that whiteness went into Black churches and made us just as patriarchal as white evangelicals. And I have to say it like that because I think this is really, upsetting for some people, but it's the truth. It is the ubiquitousness of how women are treated, sexually and wrongly in these churches where, women get objectified, and the kinds of things that happen, whether that's Bill Gothard or, all these other people, right? Bill Gothard, maybe he wasn't as bad as R. Kelly, but it's the same stream. Okay, it's the same thing, and it's coming from the same place. R. Kelly was a Baptist kid. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but he did it anyway. But he was allowed to do it because, oh, I'm a sinner. Men always get forgiven for their sexual transgressions, and women never are allowed to forget any kind of sexual transgression, whether they have participated in it complicitly or not. We don't ever get to forget it because we are made responsible for it.
I have to amen that, Anthea. I was on mute there, but oh my gosh, yes.
I wonder, Melissa, too, if you had any thoughts on, how these issues play out in Asian American circles and Asian Christian circles, because I've heard back from a number of people in various positions in Asian American churches, and talked about how, yes, there are certainly the, cultural patterns towards patriarchy and certain ideals of femininity, but then the connections to white evangelical power structures in many ways exacerbate this patriarchy, that there are certain terms for what it looks like to succeed as an Asian Christian man in some of these spaces, and patriarchy and kind of reinforcing that is absolutely critical. And, there have been some really troubling reports of patterns of abuse in Asian churches, Asian American churches as well, that very much follow. So I got contacted by a journalist not too long ago who said, so I'm covering this in this Asian American church, and I just have to talk to you because everybody's saying, just read Jesus and John Wayne and you'll understand what happened here. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on what this looks like in some of those spaces.
I think what you describe is exactly right. And what I think is challenging is that this patriarchy among Asian Americans is drawing from multiple religious sources. So I'll often hear Asian American Christians who are justifying patriarchal practices and ideologies by saying, well, this is Confucianism coming out, but it's also evangelical Christianity coming out. And so it's coming from multiple directions. And I think it makes it very difficult I also have to say it can look very different in different class positions, and Asian Americans are very class bifurcated. That you have some very well-to-do Asian Americans, model minority Asian Americans, and you have really struggling working class Asian Americans who are among the poorest groups in the US. And the way that patriarchy is playing out for these different communities is real, just in different ways. And so I do think Asian American communities, religious communities that are struggling with these diverse issues are struggling with the reality of having to do different things to meet the needs of very different groups within Asian American Christian churches. It's tough. We have discussed this kind of already. Many of you have already, amened each other's statements and made references to each other's book. But one thing that's amazing about this discussion is that everyone is talking about some of the same core issues of patriarchy, of white supremacy, but made very different choices in doing your scholarship, and have made different choices about how to engage in the public. So I wonder if we can take a little bit of time simply to discuss how you see your work engaging in the work of the other people on this panel, complementing it, maybe challenging it, bringing forth issues that the others don't. How is this relationship going on? And I invite any of you to begin.
I'll start. I made a conscious decision when I started writing not to look at Kristin's book. And that was a conscious decision, and it was the right decision, okay? So I'm making a confession now. I did not read your book until after I turned in my copy.
I had no idea. This is awesome.
Yeah, no, I did not look at it because I saw it and I was like, oh, I cannot look at this, because if I look at this, I'm going to go down a ditch. And it wasn't a bad ditch. It would just be, I would be in the ditch. And so I didn't, because in part because I felt like the story that I needed to tell was going to start a lot earlier than yours, first of all, because I kind of think I'm really kind of a 19th century person anyway, but I thought I wanted to draw a tight line. But I did think that while I was writing that I would definitely be in conversation with you, even if I didn't want to be. And I wanted to be, but I didn't want to read it because I didn't want it to, sort of influence me in any way. But now what I think is that my book is a companion to yours, because if you want to go back and read earlier about how some of these constructs happen, you have to go back and look at the 19th century to really understand, what's behind it. So that was one. I think the other way in which I'm engaging both of you is very differently, because I made a conscious decision not to do footnotes. And the reason why I did was because I was like, I want to fast read. I want to read that everybody has to take it and just go, damn. Right. And that you'd have to go figure out, I give you all the places to look. And that's been actually one of the criticisms, like, why did she put footnotes? I'm like, there's an apparatus in the back for you to go look at books from every particular point in this book. So you can go back and go read all these other people. But that was me saying, I know this story. I'm a historian. I know what my sources are. I can prove every last one of them, but you need to go figure this out for yourself. I wanted to give you something that was tight to read. And so I think if you read my book alongside, Jesus and John Wayne, and especially Biblical Womanhood, because like you said, this patriarchy and racism go together, then you can see it. They fit together like kind of a crazy Lego pastiche. And I'm not sure what you come out with the Lego. Maybe it's like, a big old Bible you're supposed to hit somebody over the head with or something. But it actually is 3 books that come together in certain kinds of ways for you to be able to see a fuller picture of what, American evangelicalism is like, and the evangelicalism that we have exported to the rest of the world. And then the rest of the world came back and brought it back to us. And that's the interesting part for me, is not just about, American missionaries, but the ways in which this gets twisted up when you go to other places and it gets back here. And I'm thinking about, in this particular case, Nigeria or Korea or Brazil. I mean, I've seen some things, and I just keep thinking, all 3 of our books are not just about America, but they're about an international focus on what evangelicalism is like in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of patriarchy and womanhood.
Absolutely. Amen to that. The global reach, I think we're all hearing from evangelicals, from global Christians who are testifying to the ways in which these ideologies have been spread around the world. And often with horrifying results. I love Anthea's answer. I think the books complement each other very nicely. Each of us had to make choices. Each of us we're pulling one thread through. And for me, I felt like sometimes it was like this multi-strand braid, and I never felt like I was doing sufficient justice to some of the strands. And so to have Anthea's book come and kind of stand alongside it. Yes, read this, and yes, go deeper into the past. I could have done so much more with especially ideas of patriarchy in the evangelical 19th century South. And I give a passing reference to that, but I could have done chapters on that. So they complement each other very nicely. And total respect for you not reading my book. I've done that, the same, like you got to keep the distance. There's two different projects here. And for Beth's book, to go back to something we were talking about before, a difference, my choice not to do personal narrative. I actually thought that by making that choice and by doing a thick book with 30 pages of footnotes in it, I thought I was going to lose a pretty big swath of the popular audience. And happily, I've been proven wrong. And I feel like a lot of readers have really risen to the occasion that this is maybe a little denser than most books they've read in their, book clubs. And so kudos to all the readers who have kind of made it through. But when I saw Beth's book in manuscript form, when she sent it to me and I sat down and I read it like in one sitting, and I was like, yes. I know what this book is going to do, right? And she is exactly right. She spoke to evangelical women in particular in their own language. And I knew that would just open up so many doors for her. And so in my book too, I talk about women and femininity in one chapter, and then I kind of come back to it, but there is so much more that needs to be done. And then finally, what Beth does is she gets theological. Right, she does, which is something that I don't really do much at all, with a very, very light touch in Jesus and John Wayne. And again, that moves it off of familiar turf for some critics. Beth just leaned into that. And again, speaking the language of evangelicals, it's high risk, but also, it really is able to communicate powerfully to the evangelical audience, and particularly to evangelical women.
So thanks for that, Kristin. I did get theological, and I got myself in a lot of trouble. It's interesting some of the criticism I've gotten for being theological, because people are like, oh, she's not a Bible scholar. And I sit here, I think, and I'm like, you know what? I bet I've been trained more than you have in biblical scholarship as well as the classical world. But that's neither here nor there. I do think, in thinking about our books, what I see here is really what the evangelical world needs to hear. I mean, if you think about white evangelicalism, they have mostly been reading the same type of people and the same story that keeps being told and retold over and over. In fact, that's one of the things that Kristin kind of talks about, is that some of this book, they're just kind of rehashed, the same book that's kind of rehashed over and over again. And those pick up in the same threads that Anthea picks up in the 19th century. And in fact, I was commenting to her that I really liked her reference to Louis Giglio in white evangelical racism, because Louis Giglio got a start at Baylor when I was a Baylor student with choice. And I remember this, and I remember the beginning of this this was really sort of the beginning of this very hardline complementarianism. And so I lived where it began, and I loved Anthea pulling that out in her book. And so I think what we see here is what evangelicals need to do. They need to start reading other voices. They need to start, our threads from different areas and people who have a different way of telling the story and looking at it. And if we did that, it would dramatically change the church. We're already seeing the impact that these books are having. And just think if that if people continued to read people who don't look like them and who don't think exactly like them. So I love our books working together, and I think that's what we need.
about 15 minutes left and some really amazing questions in the Q&A. Thank you to all of you who've listened and who put forth questions in the Q&A function. I would like to shift to that part of the discussion now. So many of you have already discussed the importance of engaging in the public and using scholarship as a means of changing the conversation and changing the church and changing the world. So let's talk about this theme of engagement. Several people have brought up the issue of engaging people. Anna in the Q&A talked about how people talk about the need to give people time, to be patient. John asked a question about helping people address the issues you bring up, the hard issues you bring up. And Pastor Claire, I'm going to read her question in full because I think it really brings out what this issue looks like in a congregation. So she writes, I'm a pastor in a mainline Protestant denomination. Our congregation is probably leans to the right, has no interest in really discovering how race and social justice have been affected by patriarchy and white evangelicalism. It's just easier for them to not pay attention to how race and gender impact the church today. Have you found ways to engage with people when they really don't want to engage in difficult conversations? And what that means for us as Christians. Okay, we'd like to take on how to engage with people who might not really want to engage.
Well, I'll start.
Okay.
Well, no, I mean, both of us can go. Beth, you go first, because what I'm going to say is.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I don't know if I have a good answer to this. I mean, this is a hard answer. This is what the white church has been doing for a really long time. It's been wanting to pretend it's colorblind and not pay attention to these issues. So, I mean, I think one of the ways is simply to meet people, you know, the areas that they are interested in, and bring in like how it changes the story when they look at it from a different direction. I mean, this is often something that you can do. You can, you know, kind of meet them where they are with things that they are interested in, and then bring in different voices on that topic, and then they can start asking questions in that area. The other thing is, and this is the hard thing, is that people often don't get interested in this until it personally affects them, until it affects somebody around them. And those are opportunities we can't let slip by us. You know, when something personally, like, you know, I keep hearing people keep saying that when somebody is against women being in leadership in church, they say that they pray for their daughter to want to preach, to decide, you know, that's the best way to get somebody to move, to have a daughter on that. So I don't know. I mean, you can't force people to drink when they don't want to drink. But what you can do is you can keep presenting them with opportunities where they can keep being exposed to different ideas. I mean, you know, just use a church history textbook that, you know, when you teach church history in church or whatever, that includes women, that includes people of color, that brings in different stories. Just don't tell the same stories that we always do from the pulpit. Bring in different voices, and that often will lead to people beginning to ask questions.
I would say to Pastor Claire that, you know, basically, if you're in a mainline Protestant denomination, let me tell you probably what happened last year when George Floyd was murdered. Probably what happened was you paid attention for 5 minutes to Black people who were there or around in your community. Some of your people pretended to go out and march for Black Lives Matter, and then they just forgot about it until we started talking about critical race theory. And then everybody got scared because, you know, critical race theory is the big bugaboo for everybody right now, right? And so you can't make people care about things that they should be caring about. But you can think about it in another way. And I will have to say that I'm probably not the person to ask about how to engage, because basically my way of engagement is like throwing the time bomb or the bomb in the room, letting it blow up and then see who's left afterwards. Because I'm not that kind of person, and I just never have been. I'm just going to tell it to you straight. And so I think that right now we have a huge problem. And part of the problem is that all of these things we've talked about tonight culminated in the 1-6 insurrection. We haven't talked about nationalism and evangelicalism right now, but here's the thing. I mean, if you call yourself an evangelical right now, you know, you have to think about that It's not a theological definition like people want it to be. It's a pejorative definition about what is happening in our country today. Evangelicals are the people who don't want to get a vaccine, who are dying from COVID, or don't want to wear a mask, or believe that Donald Trump won the election and he really didn't win the election. I mean, I could go on and on for about an hour right now about all the things that evangelicals, unfortunately, have been complicit in. That is not to say all evangelicals are bad. It's just that the movement is at a crisis point. And evangelicals don't want to see that because it is, and they'd like to stay where they are and be content. And that's most churchgoers in America. It's not just evangelicals. So what I would say is this: if they don't want to deal with everything, that's on them, because basically if COVID doesn't get them, and if, we can maintain this democracy, and if climate change doesn't get you, then good luck, because there's not going to be anybody else around anyway. So you have to be engaged, whether or not they want to or not. One of these things is going to get them. And you have to be, as a pastor, somebody who is willing to say those kinds of things and shake your congregation up and make them realize that it's not just about individualistic them. It is about the community and how are we going to continue as a group of people in this country.
Amen to that. I will add, as an aside, I recently did a study of all of the statements by churches on anti-Asian racism after Atlanta. We analyzed the statements or non-statements of 90 different denominations. Half of them did not say anything at all, but the differences were very stark among those who did say something. I found that different denominations entered into the issue based on their own needs. So historically Black Protestant denominations were really interested in engaging in the issue of Atlanta through gun violence. So I think one thing that could be really useful as a practical suggestion is finding a shared issue that you can build on. That is what a lot of denominations are doing, and I think that there is potential there. Our shared humanity as affected by the climate crisis. Though you have to believe that the climate crisis is actually happening, which is, also a big ask for some people. I have another question. This is from Sarah Moldler. Does the popularity of your books indicate a resurgence of an evangelical feminism? So it's kind of a hopeful question. Is there any indication that there is a greater concern or commitment to intersectional analysis by scholars who study evangelicalism? So where does this point us to, the popularity of your books?
Oh, I guess I'll take a stab at this. One thing I'll say for evangelicals is they love to read, right? They have a culture of reading, and they have small groups, and they have book clubs. And this is something I first wrote about in Jesus and John Wayne. And I had my editor challenge me a couple of times on publication figures that I included in my narrative. And he's like, no way, this is right. Publishers are always inflating. And then we double checked. It's like, oh yeah, New York Times reported it. It's good. So just the evangelical readership is there. And even maybe over against mainline, to get back to the previous question. So there's just a culture of readers. And the fact that then these books are being read, first of all, still kind of shocks me. It still is a surprise to see, having studied the evangelical bestsellers for so long, to know that now these books are breaking through is remarkable. Although put things in perspective, like somebody asked me a while back, are you approaching the sales of John Eldridge's Wild at Heart? Another 4 million copies, and I will be. Right? So scale here is still important. Like, for academic books, these books are doing great. For evangelical bestsellers, we have a long way to go still. So just put it in perspective. Is this a resurgence of evangelical feminism? I think it is. I think it's it's kind of a new iteration in some ways. It's not the old evangelical feminism, which is not to in any way disrespect the older, really theological focus. And a couple of generations of women, especially, and some men, have done really, really great theological work. And it's been there for a long time. And I think is either people really made use of it or completely ignored it. And I think what these books are doing are kind of fresh approaches, which my hope is, I mean, I'm regularly sending people to some of these classic books in evangelical feminism. Now that you're awakened to this, now go read the theology. It's there and it's really, really solid. It's really good. But I think also with this new phase, you mentioned intersectionality, and that is something that feels different in this moment too. As Beth was saying, also bringing more voices in and looking at the whiteness of white patriarchy, looking at what particularly Black female theologians have to offer to this critique and to this conversation, that seems to be I don't know, pointing us in a different direction. So it does feel fresh in some ways. And of course, then we have the historical backdrop of the Trump presidency of January 6th. And so the urgency is, it's not just kind of a personal issue. It's not just if you care about that sort of thing, as Anthea was saying, like, we all have to care about this. We all really have to care about this. And so I think that there's more energy there right now too.
Beth or Anthea, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Kristin on this. And I think the other thing is, one of the things that I think we didn't touch on tonight, but I think is inherent in all three of our books and the kinds of things that we're trying to deal with, is about this issue of individualism, right? Versus, how we see the world corporately, or our church or our nation or whatever. And I think, if there was something that I wish that I had put in my book, it was more about this racism and individualism that makes everybody think that this is just my individual sin, my individual personal problem.
Yes.
And I don't have to deal with this in any other way, shape, or fashion, So when we try to talk to people, or we're trying to engage or whatever, I think that issue of individualism and how this rugged individualism, this sort of Christocentric individualism of America has gotten us into this kind of weird space where we can't deal with these structural issues because it's always going to be individual.
Yeah. No, both. I mean, I think Kristin's right. I think this is different. As a historian, I look back and I'm like, there have been moments where we have seen women who have suddenly realized and have started moving forward. But I think because of social media, and I think because those barriers have broken down, those gatekeepers have broken down, and women's voices are able to get out, and people are able to hear their voices, I think social media has helped make this a different space. The gatekeepers don't work the same way anymore. And so I think that has making a big difference. It gives me a lot of hope that we can maybe change things this time. That maybe history will stop rhyming so much. So I'm hopeful. I'm also, though, I sort of also have that historical lens, and I'm like, we have been at moments like this before, and so I'm worried that that there could be something that patriarchy and racism just keep rearing up their heads in different ways and pushing us back. So I'm cautiously optimistic. And I do think that what Anthea said, one of these pieces, is that the American church is going to have to realize it's not all about us. It's not about us as individuals, but it's us as a body. That's what the church is. It's the body of Christ, but yet we act like we're here all alone. And so I think the church is going to have a new vision of itself as a body.
This has been an amazing conversation. It's prompted so many fantastic questions. Unfortunately, we have one more question for the evening because we are at time. We could probably chat all night, but football must be watched, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess my final question is, what's next? Aaron West asked questions for next steps for the church, for our society. So I invite you to take up that question, but also John asked, what are you working on next? So for our last question, tell us what's next for you and what do you think should be next for the world?
Well, that's kind of big. Um, World peace, a woman president. I mean, little things. Um, I think I'll talk about what I think is next for evangelicalism. Okay. I think that's the way, this is what we're talking about tonight. So I think that all of our books point to particular structural issues in terms of what is going on with evangelicals and what's going on with the church. And I don't know what happens next. And a lot of what happens next will have to do with, in my personal view, the 22 election and the 24 election, and seeing how that really plays out, because there are a lot of things going on right now. That's a whole nother conversation about, how things are being manipulated or not manipulated or done or not done, that are going to affect what happens to all of the subjects that we've talked about tonight. So that's one. Personally, I have a couple of things that I need to do. One is finish a book on the 19th century Black church. I have a piece coming out, which will probably get more attention for my book than my book alone, and the 1619 Project book about the Black church and the history of democracy in America. So that'll be something that I'll be talking about a lot in the next couple of months. And then I have this kind of idea in the back of my head, which was, I did not tell my two interlocutories about this tonight, but I have an idea in the back of my head about Black and white women in friendship, because I think that this is a really interesting subject, especially right now. And so, now that I'm full professor, I can write what I want to write. And I think that that might be a book about that and religious viewpoints that might be really interesting to sort of think about, because I think, while we're talking about patriarchy and all of these things, a lot of what has happened to African-American women and white women all surround these ideas about, the perfect home, beauty, all of this stuff. And I'm not quite interested in that. What I'm interested in is how women try to maintain friendships across racial lines and how that works or doesn't work.
Well, that's very exciting. I can't wait to see where that goes. So let's see, future for evangelicalism. I hear a lot of, just heart-wrenching stories from white evangelicals, many of whom are really struggling with feeling like they wasted 20 or 30 years of their lives, and feeling, again, complicit in this, and really just feeling distraught. And so one of the things that I remind some of these letter writers is that the church, if you're a person of faith, if you're a Christian, the church does not actually depend, it does not rise and fall on the faithfulness of white evangelicals. Because white evangelicals have for a very long time told themselves that it does. And so you can just relax, like whether you guys get it right or not, the church is actually thriving in many spaces right now in this country, spaces that are not white, spaces that are not evangelical. So maybe just go find some of those spaces. I would say too that within evangelicalism, this reckoning is very real. It is very deep. It is very personal. But I don't see it taking hold of institutions for the most part. And so I think a question is, what can we do? We collectively, we Americans, we Christians, however you want to define this, evangelicals, I don't know, to build new institutions, because I think in some ways it's hard to build from the ground up, but it might be even harder to reform existing institutions and power structures. So I think we're looking at some of those big questions. For me personally, I am working on my next book, which is called Live, Laugh, Love. And it is a cultural history of white Christian womanhood, also looking at popular culture, taking it seriously. So things like inspirational fiction and mommy blogs and Hallmark movies, but analyzing this all through the lenses of neoliberalism, post-feminism, and white supremacy. So that's what's keeping me busy. The writing is going a little more slowly than I would like. Don't tell my editor yet, but the research is absolutely phenomenal. It is so much fun. So that's what I'm doing.
So along with football bringing it into us, my kids have started texting me. So I guess, that also signals the end. But what's next for evangelicalism? I think evangelicals are going to have to realize it's not all about us, and realize that there is a whole world of Christianity out there that we've ignored in the past and that we are currently ignoring now. and that we are going to have to we're going to have to take off our self-centered focus. I loved Anthea Butler's term, Christocentric individualism. You're going to have some medievalists jumping all over that, thinking about Christocentrism. So I really love that term. But I think I'm hoping that people who have been in the evangelical world are going to wake up and look around them and start seeing how much bigger the Christian world and even the broader world in which we are part of, really is. So that's my hope, maybe still a little bit hopeful. As for me, I do have an academic book that I put on the hold while doing this on women in late medieval English sermons, but I have also started working on a new project that I won't tell you that much about yet, but it is going to continue with this theme of really what we have lost, the cost of us forgetting our church history. So
wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I apologize we weren't able to get to all of your questions, but we hope that you'll follow all of our panelists on Twitter. Lots of great conversation there for sure. And thank you most of all to Anthea, Beth, and Kristin for an amazing evening.
And thanks to you for leading us so well and moderating, Melissa. We really appreciate it.
Yes.
My
yes,
pleasure. My pleasure.
yes, thank you.
Women's friendship, scholarly friendship. I'm here for it. So thank you.
Yes. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.